I never thought the most painful words of my life would come from the lips of my own daughter, in front of the whole family, on my 64th birthday. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Robert Miller. I'm 64 years old, and for 4 decades I worked as a mechanic in a small shop on the outskirts of a Midwestern city. I've always been a humble man, the kind who prefers actions to words, who measures his wealth not in dollars, but in his family's smiles. March 15th, 2024 should have been a special day for me, but it became the date that marked the end of the relationship with my only daughter. That morning I woke up early as always. At 64, the body no longer lets you sleep in, and besides, I had a lot to prepare. I had decided to celebrate my birthday at home. Nothing fancy, just a simple family gathering. I bought a cake from Linda's bakery, the same one I'd been buying from since Natalie was little, and I prepared some homemade snacks. I invited my brother David, my ex-wife Christine, my daughter Natalie with her husband Thomas, and my 8-year-old grandson Paul. The house smelled like fresh baked pie when the guests started to arrive. David arrived first, punctual as always, with a bottle of red wine and that warm smile we inherited from our father. Christine arrived shortly after, elegant but not over the top, maintaining the friendliness we had cultivated in the 10 years since our divorce. We were a broken family, but not enemies. Thomas arrived with Paul, who ran to hug me shouting, "Grandpa, happy birthday," with that energy only children have. His hug filled my heart with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas greeted me respectfully, although I noticed a certain tension in his face that I couldn't interpret at that moment. Natalie was the last to arrive, and right from the doorway, I could tell something was wrong. She walked with unsteady steps. Her eyes were glassy, and her smile was too wide. It was obvious she had been drinking before she came. At 32, my daughter had developed a problematic relationship with alcohol, especially when she felt pressured or uncomfortable. "Hi, Dad," she said with a slightly slurred voice, giving me a mechanical hug that smelled like gin and tonic. "Happy birthday." I decided not to comment on her state. It was my birthday, and the last thing I wanted was to start a family argument. Over the last few years, I had learned to walk on eggshells with Natalie, avoiding any topic that could trigger her angry outbursts or hurtful comments. The dinner went on normally. David and I talked about football. Christine told me about her new job at the city library, and Paul entertained us with stories from his school. Thomas remained quiet, only answering when asked directly. Natalie drank glass after glass of wine, participating little in the conversation. When it was time to blow out the candles on the cake, we all sang the traditional happy birthday. Paul clapped enthusiastically, and for a moment, I felt that everything was right in my little world. I made a silent wish that my family would be united and at peace. After dessert, David suggested that everyone say a few words to congratulate me. It was a tradition we had kept for years at family birthdays. He took the microphone from the stereo I had connected to create some ambiance during dinner. My brother spoke first, remembering our childhood together, and thanking me for everything I had done for the family. Christine followed, mentioning the good years we shared and acknowledging that despite the divorce I had been a good father to Natalie. Paul, with his father's help, said a few sweet words that moved me to tears. Then it was Natalie's turn. When Thomas passed her the microphone, she stood up, swaying slightly. The smile on her face had something unsettling, something I couldn't decipher at that moment. She took the microphone with both hands and cleared her throat. What happened next changed everything forever. Natalie held the microphone like it was a weapon, with that twisted smile I knew so well from her teenage years. The alcohol had erased any filter she might have had, and her eyes shone with a mix of cruel amusement and pent-up resentment. "Well, well," she began, slurring her words as she swayed slightly. "It's the daughter's turn, right?" She laughed in a way that set my nerves on edge. What can I say about my dear father? The atmosphere in the dining room changed instantly. Christine frowned, worried. David exchanged a look with me, as if he knew something bad was about to happen. Thomas leaned forward, clearly nervous, while Paul looked at his mother with childish confusion. "My father," Natalie continued, making a dramatic pause that chilled my blood, "has always been special." Her tone was sarcastic, venomous. Working in that filthy little shop for 40 years, thinking that made him important, I felt like I had been slapped. That filthy little shop had paid for her education, her clothes, her whims, and eventually, the apartment where she lived. But I stayed silent, hoping she would stop, that she would come to her senses. "You know what?" she went on, her voice louder now, addressing everyone present as if she were giving a speech. "I've been thinking a lot lately about what kind of man my father really is." "Natalie, I think that's enough," Thomas intervened gently, reaching for the microphone. But she pushed him away with a sharp gesture. "No, I'm not finished," she yelled, and then her eyes locked onto mine with a coldness I had never seen before. Because the truth, the pure and simple truth, is that the silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Paul had stopped playing with his napkin and was looking at all of us with big, scared eyes. Christine had a hand on her chest, as if she had lost her breath. "A miserable father is not to be celebrated," Natalie declared in a clear, loud voice, each word a direct stab to the heart, and then she started to laugh. It wasn't a nervous or embarrassed laugh. It was a genuine, cruel cackle, as if she had told the funniest joke in the world. She laughed while looking directly into my eyes, enjoying every second of my shock and pain. The room exploded into chaos. David stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. "Natalie, what the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, moving towards her. Christine brought both hands to her mouth, horrified. Thomas finally managed to get the microphone out of her hands while muttering, "That's enough, Natalie, that's enough." But the damage was done. Those words hung in the air like a curse that couldn't be undone. All eyes were on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to explode, to scream, to make a scene. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I smiled. It wasn't a fake or forced smile. It was the smile of a man who had just understood something fundamental about his life. For years, I had walked on eggshells. I had put up with minor hurtful comments. I had excused her behavior with alcohol, stress, youth. But in that moment, with those words echoing in my ears, something crystal clear and cold settled in my chest. "Interesting perspective," I said with a calmness that surprised even my brother. "Very interesting." I got up from my chair with deliberately calm movements, as if nothing had happened. "Anyone want more wine?" I asked, heading towards the kitchen. "I think this celebration needs more joy." Natalie had stopped laughing and was looking at me with a confused expression. She clearly expected shouts, tears, pleas. She didn't expect this unsettling serenity that had descended upon me like an invisible armor. "Robert," Christine began, but I gently raised a hand to stop her. "Everything is fine," I lied with a perfectly convincing smile. "It's my birthday, after all." Natalie is just expressing her feelings. Very honest of her, really. David followed me into the kitchen, clearly worried. "Brother, what just happened?" I heard it. I cut him off, pouring wine into a glass with perfectly steady hands. I heard her very clearly. But inside, my mind was already at work. For 40 years, I had built a life based on respect, the dignity of honest work, and unconditional love for my family. In a moment, with 7 cruel words, my own daughter had trampled all over that in front of the people who mattered most in my life. This wasn't the first time. I clearly remembered my 62nd birthday, when she called me pathetic for still working at my age, and at Cousin Michael's wedding last year, when she introduced me to her friends as my father, the mechanic, with a tone that dripped with disdain. But this time, she had crossed an irreversible line. I returned to the dining room with my glass of wine, maintaining that serene smile that was starting to scare everyone. The conversation resumed awkwardly, but the festive mood was completely dead. Paul snuggled against Christine, clearly affected by the tension he didn't fully understand. 20 minutes later, after some forced small talk about the weather and traffic problems in Chicago, I politely excused myself. "Excuse me," I said, placing my glass on the table with excessive care. "I need to use the restroom." No one suspected a thing. Why would they? But as I walked down the hall, with measured and calm steps, my mind had already made a decision that would change our lives forever. I closed the bathroom door behind me and stood still for a moment, looking at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me had 64 years of honestly earned wrinkles, gray hairs that had come from working under car hoods, and eyes that had seen too much. But in those eyes, there was also something new, a cold determination I had never felt before. "A miserable father is not to be celebrated." The words kept echoing in my head like funeral bells. It wasn't just the cruelty of the words, but the way she had said them, the malicious satisfaction in her voice, the way she had savored every syllable of my public humiliation. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and let the memories flow freely. It wasn't the first time Natalie had hurt me with her words, but it was the first time she had done it so deliberately and publicly. The first humiliation had been 2 years ago, on my 62nd birthday. We were at the Grandpa's Tavern, a modest but cozy place I had chosen to celebrate. When the waiter asked if anyone wanted to toast the birthday boy, Natalie had raised her wine glass and said, "To my father, who at 62 still gets his hands dirty like a teenager." I guess some people never learn to aim for something better. At the time, I thought she had had too much to drink, that it wasn't really her talking. I forgave her because she was my daughter, because she had been raised to be better than that, because I believed that deep down she loved me. The second humiliation had been more subtle, but just as painful. At Cousin Michael's wedding in September 2023, Natalie had brought some friends from her job at the insurance office. When she introduced me to them, her tone had been dismissive. "This is my father, Robert. He's a mechanic. Well, he still works fixing cars." The pause before "still" and the way she had pronounced "fixing cars" as if it were something shameful had hurt me more than any physical blow. But I had convinced myself I was being too sensitive, that maybe I had misinterpreted her words, that the alcohol had spoken for her again. Now, sitting in this bathroom while my family continued to feign normality in the dining room, I finally understood the truth. It wasn't the alcohol. It was her. It was who she really was beneath all my paternal illusions. For 32 years I had been her father. I had carried her on my shoulders when she was 5 and wanted to see the Christmas parade. I had taught her to ride a bike in Lincoln Park, running behind her, with my hands outstretched to catch her if she fell. I had worked double shifts for months to pay for piano lessons she quit after 3 months, ballet classes she left after 2 weeks, English classes she ended up hating. When she turned 18 and wanted to study business administration, I sold my motorcycle, a 1,985 Harley-Davidson that I had restored with my own hands over 3 years, to pay for her university tuition. I never told her, but that motorcycle represented my only personal luxury, my only concession to the dreams of my youth. When she married Thomas at 25, I gave her the apartment on Maple Avenue, number 45, a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent area of Chicago that had cost me my entire adult life savings. I put it in her name without a second thought, because I believed a father should give everything for his children without expecting anything in return. And for all these years, whenever she needed money for repairs, for vacations, for whims, I had been there. I never said no. I never asked what she needed it for. I just opened my wallet and gave what I could. And this was what I got in return: to be called miserable in front of my family, in my own house, on my birthday. I got up from the edge of the tub and looked at myself in the mirror again. This time, the man looking back at me had changed. His eyes no longer showed pain or confusion. They showed resolution. I took my cell phone out of my jacket pocket. It was a simple model, nothing fancy, but it did what I needed it to do. I dialed the number I knew by heart. Bank of America customer service. "This is Elena. How can I help you?" "Good afternoon. This is Robert Miller. Account number 0049UNZ03456789UNTUUUUZO. I need to immediately block 3 additional cards associated with my account. Of course, Mr. Miller. Could you confirm your social security number to proceed with verification?" I gave them all the necessary information. Elena was efficient and professional. In 5 minutes, the 3 cards Natalie used for her daily expenses were permanently blocked. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Mr. Miller?" "No, that's all. Thank you for your help." I hung up and immediately looked in my contacts for the number of Richard Montoya, the real estate agent I had met last year when I had considered selling the house and moving to a smaller apartment. "Richard, it's Robert Miller. Do you remember me? We talked last year about properties." "Of course, Robert. How are you? Have you finally decided to sell your house?" "Not exactly. I have another property, an apartment on Maple Avenue, number 45, 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, open kitchen. It's in my name. I want to put it on the market immediately." Richard paused. He probably noticed something strange in my tone, but he was too professional to ask personal questions. "Perfect. That's an excellent area. It sells well. When can we meet to do the valuation and prepare the paperwork?" "Tomorrow morning, if possible." "And, Richard, I need you to put up the for sale sign as soon as possible, preferably tomorrow." "Understood. Let's say 9 inches the morning. Perfect." I hung up the phone and put it in my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. My pulse was normal. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my life. From the dining room came muffled voices. Christine was probably trying to calm things down. David would be angry. And Thomas would be trying to find excuses for his wife's behavior. Natalie was probably drinking more wine. feeling proud of her brutal honesty. But none of that mattered anymore. I had made decisions that would change everything, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with myself. I flushed the toilet to keep up appearances. I washed my hands carefully and prepared to return to my birthday party. The smile I practiced in the mirror before leaving was genuine. It wasn't the smile of a hurt father. It was the smile of a man who had just regained his dignity. I stayed in the bathroom for a few more minutes, not because I needed time to process what I had just done, but because I wanted my actions to have the maximum impact. I knew Natalie would try to use her cards tomorrow morning for her daily coffee at Starbucks, as she had religiously done every day for the past 3 years. The surprise would be educational. In the meantime, I mentally reviewed all the details of what I had set in motion. The blocked cards were 3. A debit card she used for daily expenses with a monthly limit of $1,500, a credit card for emergencies with a limit of $5,000, and another premium credit card I had given her last year for her special expenses with a limit of $3,000. In total, Natalie had lost access to almost $10,000 a month that I financed without blinking. The apartment on Maple Avenue was another story. I had bought it in 2017 for $250,000, paying a down payment of $100,000, which represented all my savings at the time, and financing the rest with a mortgage that I had finished paying off last year, working extra hours on weekends. Now it was probably worth $300,000, maybe more, considering the appreciation of the area. Richard Montoya was a competent professional who knew the Chicago market well. If I told him I needed to sell fast, he would find buyers. The location was excellent. The apartment was in good condition, and the price we would have to set would be attractive to investors. What reassured me most was the legal clarity of the whole process. The apartment was completely in my name. When I gave it to Natalie for her wedding, I had made a verbal promise, but legally it was still mine. I had never made the official transfer because my lawyer, Charles Mendoza, had advised me to keep it that way for tax reasons. You can always make the change later, he had told me, but keeping it in your name gives you more flexibility. How prophetic that advice had turned out to be. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was approaching the bathroom. I recognized the heavy walk of my brother David. "Robert, are you okay in there?" he asked with a worried voice through the door. "Perfectly fine," I replied, adjusting my shirt in front of the mirror one last time. "I'm coming out." I opened the door and was met with David's distressed face. My younger brother, at 58, still had that worried puppy expression he'd had since he was a kid when something bothered him. "Brother, what happened in there?" he began, but I stopped him with a friendly pat on the shoulder. "David, my dear brother, don't worry. You know what I discovered tonight?" He looked at me with bewilderment. "What?" "That the truth can be liberating. Natalie has finally been honest with me about what she really thinks of her father. Isn't it wonderful? I no longer have to wonder if she really appreciates me or if she's just pretending for convenience." David frowned. He knew his older brother well enough to know that this calmness was not normal. "Robert, she was drunk. She probably won't even remember what she said tomorrow." "Oh, she'll remember," I said with a smile that must have seemed unsettling, because David took a step back. "I guarantee she'll remember it perfectly." We returned to the dining room, where the situation had become more tense in my absence. Natalie was sitting in her chair with her arms crossed, staring at her empty wineglass with a sullen expression. Thomas had a hand on her shoulder, clearly trying to calm her, while whispering something in her ear. Paul had fallen asleep on the couch, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. Christine approached me as soon as I returned. "Robert, I think we should talk about what happened. Natalie is in no condition to—" "Christine," I interrupted gently. "I appreciate your concern, but everything is fine, really." I walked over to Natalie, who looked up as I approached. Her eyes were glassy, but there was something defiant in her gaze, as if she were proud of what she had said. "Dad," she said in a slightly slurred voice, "aren't you going to say anything about, you know?" "About what, dear?" I asked with a genuinely curious tone. "About what I said, about what you are." She stopped as if she suddenly realized she might have gone too far. "Ah, that," I said, nodding understandingly. "You mean when you said a miserable father is not to be celebrated?" The silence in the room became sepulchral. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. Thomas had turned visibly pale. "Well," I continued in the same conversational tone, "I suppose you have a right to your opinion. After all, you're a 32-year-old adult woman. If that's your honest assessment of your father, after everything we've shared together, Then it must be true. Natalie blinked, clearly confused by my reaction. She had expected shouts, tears, pleas. She hadn't expected this serene acceptance. Dad, I was. You were what? Drunk, joking? I smiled warmly. Natalie, dear, alcohol doesn't invent feelings. It only releases them. I turned to the rest of the family. I think it's been a very revealing night for all of us, a night of important truths. David looked at me as if I were a stranger. Christine had her hands clasped, nervous. Thomas had started gathering Paul's things, clearly anxious to leave. Well, I announced, clapping my hands softly, I think it's time for us all to get some rest. It's been a memorable birthday. I helped Thomas lift Paul from the couch. The boy woke up just enough to give me a sleepy hug. I love you, Grandpa, he murmured against my neck. And I love you, Champ, I replied, feeling a pang of genuine pain. Paul was innocent in all of this. He didn't deserve to be affected by the consequences of his mother's actions. As everyone got ready to leave, I maintained my perfect composure. I hugged David, kissed Christine's cheek, shook Thomas's hand firmly. When it was Natalie's turn, she approached hesitantly. Dad, she began, but I stopped her with a hug. It's been a perfect birthday, daughter, I whispered in her ear. Absolutely perfect. The confusion in her eyes was evident when she pulled away from me. She didn't understand my reaction, and that was exactly what I wanted. I walked them to the door, saying goodbye to everyone with smiles and kind words. When I finally closed the door behind the last guest, I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence of my house. Tomorrow would be a very interesting day. I walked to the kitchen and began to collect the plates and glasses from dinner. As I washed each piece with meticulous care, I whistled a song my mother used to sing to me when I was a child. It was a cheerful, optimistic melody. After all, I had many reasons to be cheerful. I had just made the most important decisions of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. After finishing the dishes, I poured myself a glass of the Scotch whiskey I saved for special occasions. Ironically, tonight qualified as a very special occasion, though not in the way I had imagined when I woke up this morning. I sat in my favorite armchair, the same one where I had read stories to Natalie when she was little, and let my mind wander through the past. It wasn't masochism. It was necessary. I needed to remember exactly how I had gotten to this point, how a man who had given everything for his daughter had ended up being called miserable on his own birthday. It all started when Natalie was 6 years old. Carmen, my first wife and Natalie's mother, had died in a car accident on I-90, coming back from visiting her sister in Milwaukee. Overnight, I became a single father to a little girl who didn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. Those first years were the hardest of my existence. I worked at Mr. Antonio Ruiz's workshop from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. Then I would rush to pick up Natalie from the neighbor's house. Mrs. Pilar, who helped me by taking care of her, in exchange for me fixing her car for free. I spent the nights helping her with homework, preparing simple dinners, and reading her stories until she fell asleep. I never complained, never considered it a burden. She was my daughter, my responsibility, my greatest joy. When she smiled, when she hugged me with those little arms and said, "I love you, Daddy," I felt that all the tiredness in the world was worth it. At 10, Natalie wanted to learn piano. The nearest instructor, Mr. Edward Vasquez, charged $60 per class. On my mechanic's salary, that was almost a full day's work, but I found a way. I sold my collection of special tools, the ones I had inherited from my own father, and worked 2 Saturdays a month fixing cars for private clients to get the extra money. Natalie quit piano after 3 months. "It's boring, Dad. I don't like it anymore." Just like that. $180. I never got back, but I said nothing. Kids change their minds, I told myself. It's normal. Then came ballet at age 12. This time it was the special shoes, the tutu, the classes 3 times a week, with Miss Isabella at the dance studio near downtown. I worked extra shifts during the summer to pay for it. I vividly remember those exhausting afternoons under the Chicago sun, with my hands torn up from work, thinking about Natalie's smile when I would see her dance in the year-end recital. The ballet lasted exactly 2 months. The other girls are better than me, Dad. I don't want to keep making a fool of myself. More money lost, more effort wasted. But again, I swallowed my words and looked for something new to make her happy. When she turned 15, she decided she wanted to be bilingual. "Dad, all my friends speak English perfectly. I'm the only one who can't hold a conversation." I enrolled her in the best language academy in the area, English Corner. which charged $120 a month. To get that money, I started working on Sundays too, the only day I had free to rest or do things around the house. For 2 years, I religiously took Natalie to her English classes. 2 years of lost Sundays, of cold dinners because I came home late from the shop, of a sore back from not having a single day of rest. In the end, her English level was basic at best. The teacher is very strict, Dad. I don't like his teaching method. But the real sacrifice came when Natalie turned 18 and decided to study business administration at the state university. The annual tuition was $4,000, not including books, transportation, and personal expenses. With my mechanic's salary, it was financially impossible. It was then that I made the most painful decision of my life up to that point. I sold my 1,985 Harley-Davidson, a motorcycle I had restored piece by piece over 3 years of patient work in my spare time. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was my personal project, my escape, my only connection to the dreams of youth I had left behind when I became a responsible father. I sold it for $8,000 to a collector from Street, Louis, who wanted it for his private museum. $8,000 that covered exactly 2 years of university for Natalie. I never told her where that money came from. I just told her I had found a way to pay for it. During her university years, Natalie lived like a princess. She had her own room in a shared apartment near the campus, money for clothes, for outings with friends, for summer vacations on the coast. Meanwhile, I continued to work double shifts, bringing sandwiches from home for lunch, because eating in restaurants was a luxury I couldn't afford. When she graduated at 22, I expected her to find a job quickly. She had studied business administration, had good grades, spoke basic English. But Natalie had standards. She didn't want to work in small companies. She didn't accept undignified salaries. She wasn't willing to start from the bottom like everyone else. For 3 years after graduating, she continued to live off my money while looking for the perfect opportunity. 3 years in which I continued to work like a mule to maintain her lifestyle, while she complained that companies didn't recognize her talent. At 25, she met Thomas Jimenez Vidal, an architect from a well-off family who worked at a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago. They fell in love, or at least that's what I thought at the time, and decided to get married the following year. For the wedding, Natalie had grandiose dreams. She wanted a ceremony in a historic church, a banquet for 200 guests, a designer dress, a professional photographer, a honeymoon in Paris. The total budget was $40,000. I didn't have $40,000. I didn't even have half, but it was my only daughter's wedding, and a father does what he has to do. I mortgaged the house I had inherited from my parents, the same house where I had grown up, where I had raised Natalie after Carmen's death. The wedding was perfect. Natalie was radiant. Thomas seemed like a man in love. The guests had a great time. During the reception, when Natalie gave her thank you speech, she mentioned all the special people who had made this magical day possible. She named me at the end, almost as a footnote, and thanks to Dad, of course, for his support, as if it were something minor, something insignificant. But the biggest sacrifice came after the wedding. As a gift, I decided to buy them the apartment on Maple Avenue, $250,000, which represented literally everything I had saved during my adult life, plus a mortgage that would keep me working until I was 70. I put it in Natalie's name without a second thought. It was her wedding gift, her start in adult life, my way of making sure she would never lack a roof over her head. And for the last 7 years since Paul was born, I had continued to be her financial safety net. When Thomas lost work contracts, when Paul needed something special for school, when they wanted to go on vacation, when the car broke down, when they simply wanted to treat themselves, there I was, opening my wallet without complaints. I never expected eternal gratitude. I never expected to be treated like a hero. I only expected basic respect, the respect that any father deserves from his children. Instead, I had received growing disdain, hurtful comments about my job, my education, my social status, and, tonight, the straw that broke the camel's back. To be called miserable publicly, in front of my entire family. I finished my whiskey and looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. on March 16th. In a few hours, Natalie would discover that her financial world had changed forever, and for the first time in decades, I slept soundly, without nightmares, without worries. Tomorrow, my new life would begin. I woke up at 6 a.m. on March 16th with a strange feeling of lightness that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the usual heaviness of a 4-year-old man with back pain from 4 decades of physical labor. It was the feeling of someone who had made important decisions and was at peace with the consequences. I prepared my usual breakfast: black coffee, 2 pieces of toast with olive oil and grated tomato, and a glass of natural orange juice. While I ate, I mentally reviewed the events of the previous night to make sure it hadn't all been a strange, stress-induced dream. No, it had all been real. Natalie's words, my controlled reaction, the phone calls from the bathroom, and the strange peace I had felt upon making those decisions. This morning, the wheels I had set in motion would begin to turn. At 7:30, my phone rang. It was Richard Montoya, punctual as he had promised. "Good morning, Robert. I've been thinking about your apartment on Maple Avenue. It's an excellent area, and if it's in good condition, we could get a very competitive price. Are we confirmed for the 9 o'clock appointment?" "Confirmed, Richard. I'll wait for you at the building's entrance." After hanging up, I showered and dressed carefully. Not in my usual work clothes, but in my best suit, the same one I had worn to Natalie's wedding. I had to make the right impression when future buyers saw the apartment. During the subway ride to Maple Avenue, I reflected on what I was about to do. Technically, the apartment was mine. Legally, I had every right to sell it. Morally, well, that was a more complex issue. I had given Natalie that apartment as a gesture of paternal love, with the implicit expectation that she would treat me with respect and affection. That emotional contract had been repeatedly violated, culminating in the public humiliation of last night. If she could break her part of the agreement, I could break mine. I arrived at building number 45 on Maple Avenue 5 minutes before 9. It was a well-maintained red brick building from the 82nds, with a doorman and an elevator. The area was quiet but central, with easy access to public transport and shops. Any young family would be delighted to live there. Richard arrived punctually, accompanied by a professional photographer and a young woman he introduced as his assistant, Clara Mendoza. "Robert, good to see you. Do you have the keys?" I took out the spare set of keys I had kept since I handed the apartment over to Natalie. I had always insisted that I should have a copy for emergencies, although I had never used it until today. We went up to the 2nd floor. As Richard inserted the key into the lock, I heard movement inside the apartment. It was Saturday morning. Of course they would be home. The door opened, and we came face to face with Thomas, who was coming out of the bedroom in his pajamas with a look of total confusion. "Robert, what are you doing here, and who are these people?" "Good morning, Thomas," I replied with perfect cordiality. "Let me introduce you to Richard Montoya, a real estate agent, his assistant Clara, and the professional photographer Miguel. They're here to do the appraisal and take pictures of the apartment." Thomas blinked several times, as if the words didn't make sense. "Appraisal? For what?" "For the sale, of course." At that moment, Natalie appeared from the kitchen, still in her robe and with her hair disheveled. Her eyes were swollen, probably from the hangover, but I could also detect traces of tears. Maybe she had cried after coming home. Maybe she had started to process what she had said. "Dad, what's going on here?" she asked, in a hoarse voice. As I was explaining to Thomas, "These gentlemen are here to evaluate the apartment before putting it on the market." Natalie stood frozen for a moment, processing my words. Then, as if she had received an electric shock, she screamed, "What? You're going to sell our apartment?" "My apartment," I corrected her gently. "Technically, it's always been my apartment. It's in my name, I pay the taxes, I finance the purchase. I simply allowed you to live here as a favor." Richard, Clara, and Miguel exchanged uncomfortable glances. They clearly hadn't expected to find themselves in the middle of a family drama. "Richard," I said, turning to the real estate agent, "could we proceed with the evaluation? The apartment has 2 bedrooms, a full bathroom, an open kitchen with a dining area, and a small balcony overlooking the inner courtyard." "Of course," Richard replied professionally, although I could sense his nervousness. "Miguel, start with the photos of the living room." While the photographer began his work, Natalie grabbed my arm. "Dad, we need to talk, in private. I'm afraid there's nothing to talk about, dear. The decision has already been made." "Please," her voice broke. "What I said last night. I was drunk, I didn't mean it. You know how I get when I drink too much." I looked directly into her eyes. In them I could see genuine fear for the first time in years. Not fear for her emotional well-being or for our father-daughter relationship, but fear for the financial consequences of her actions. "Natalie, for years I've heard that excuse. I was drunk, I didn't mean it. But last night I realized something important. Alcohol doesn't create feelings, it only reveals them. What you said last night is what you really think of me. Thomas had come closer and was now part of the conversation. Robert, please, be reasonable. We have a child. We need stability. We can't just move out overnight. Of course not, I agreed kindly. That's why I've instructed Richard to make the eviction period 60 days. That will give you enough time to find another place to live. 60 days! Natalie exclaimed hysterically. Dad, we can't find a decent apartment in 60 days on our budget. Then perhaps you should consider adjusting your expectations of what constitutes a decent apartment, I replied. There are many affordable options in the suburbs of Chicago. The South Side, for example. Joliet, Aurora. Perfectly habitable apartments for $600 or $700 a month. I saw the horror in her eyes. For Natalie, who had lived in downtown Chicago her entire adult life, the idea of moving to the suburbs was apparently worse than death. But Dad, she tried one last time in a pleading voice, where are we going to get the money for a new security deposit? For the move? For... Ah, yes, I said, as if I had just remembered something important. You should probably know that last night, after your inspiring speech, I also canceled all your credit and debit cards associated with my account. This time, Thomas also turned visibly pale. He clearly knew exactly how much money those cards represented in their household economy. Paul appeared from his room, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Grandpa, what are you doing here? Why is Mommy crying? My heart ached, seeing my grandson. He was truly innocent in all this, and would be the one to suffer most from his mother's actions. I crouched down to his level. Hey, champ. Grandpa came to take care of some grown-up business. Nothing you need to worry about. Paul hugged me with that total trust that only children can show. Can you stay for lunch? Mommy promised to make paella. I'm afraid I can't stay, Paul, but I promise we'll arrange a special outing soon, just you and me. Would you like to go to the amusement park? His eyes lit up. Yes! When? Next week. I'll call you to coordinate with your parents. Richard approached discreetly. Robert, we're done with the photos and measurements. Could we talk outside about the price and marketing strategy? Of course. I headed for the door, followed by Richard's team. At the threshold, I turned to Natalie and Thomas. The for sale sign will be installed this afternoon. The first interested parties will probably start calling on Monday. I suggest you start looking for alternative housing immediately. Dad, Natalie whispered, but there were no more tears in her eyes, only a cold understanding that she had gravely underestimated her father. Have a good day, I wished them politely, and closed the door behind me. In the elevator, Richard finally dared to comment. Complicated family situation, huh? Yes, I replied simply. But sometimes you have to make tough decisions to restore balance. We left the building and walked to a nearby cafe to discuss the details of the sale. While Richard talked about market prices and marketing strategies, I thought about the expression of genuine shock in Natalie's eyes. For the first time in her life, she had discovered that actions have real consequences, and this was just the beginning. Saturday afternoon passed with a strange tranquility. After my meeting with Richard at the cafe, I went home and spent the time on everyday activities, reading the newspaper, organizing some papers, calling my brother David to briefly tell him what had happened that morning. His reaction was one of initial shock, followed by gradual understanding. Brother, he had told me, I never thought you would reach this point, but after what I saw last night, I think Natalie needs to learn an important lesson. Saturday evening was quiet. No calls from Natalie, no messages from Thomas. They were probably processing the magnitude of what had happened, perhaps desperately looking for options, maybe hoping it was all a nightmare they would soon wake up from. Sunday also passed without incident. I went to Mass at Street, Andrew's Church, as I had every Sunday for 30 years. During the homily, Father Garcia spoke about forgiveness and family reconciliation. I wondered if it was a coincidence or if someone had told him about my situation. Chicago is a big city, but neighborhoods retain that small-town mentality where news travels fast. After Mass, I had lunch alone at home. Lentil stew with chorizo, a recipe I had perfected during my years as a single father. As I ate, I reflected on whether I was doing the right thing. Doubts are natural when you make decisions that will change lives forever. But every time I remembered the expression of cruel satisfaction on Natalie's face as she uttered those hurtful words, my resolve strengthened. Monday morning, March 18th, started early. At 6:30 I was already awake, making coffee and checking the news on my tablet. At 7, Richard sent me a message confirming that the for sale sign had been installed the day before and that they had already received 3 phone inquiries from potential buyers. At 7:30 sharp, my phone started to ring. The caller ID showed Natalie's number. I let it ring 4 times before answering, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to be completely calm when we spoke. "Good morning, Natalie," I greeted in a neutral tone. "Dad!" Her voice was high-pitched, desperate, with an undertone of panic I had never heard before. "My cards don't work. I went to buy coffee this morning at the usual Starbucks, and they told me my debit card was declined. I thought it was a system error, but then I tried the credit card, and it was also declined. And then with the other credit card, and it didn't work either." Her breathing was ragged, as if she had run a marathon. I could picture her perfectly, standing on the sidewalk outside Starbucks, her morning coffee denied, surrounded by people on their way to work, feeling humiliated by the public rejection of her cards. "Ah, yes," I replied naturally, as if we were talking about the weather. I did indeed cancel all the cards associated with my account on Friday night. "What? But Dad, you can't do that!" "Those cards are for my basic expenses, for the weekly groceries, for gas for the car, for everything." "Natalie, dear," I explained patiently, "those cards were linked to my personal bank account. I was the one who paid all the charges every month. After reflecting on your assessment of my character on Friday night, I decided that a miserable father probably shouldn't be financing the lifestyle of a daughter who despises him." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear her heavy breathing, probably trying to process the connection between her words on Friday and the consequences on Monday. "Dad, please, you have to understand that. You were drunk," I interrupted gently. "Yes, you already told me, but as I explained on Saturday, alcohol doesn't invent feelings, it only releases them. But I can't live without those cards. Thomas is going through a rough patch at work. We barely have enough money for basic expenses." This was new and interesting information. Apparently, the couple's financial situation was more precarious than I had imagined. That explained Thomas's nervousness during Saturday's visit. "Well," I suggested kindly, "I suppose it will be an excellent opportunity for both you and Thomas to develop a more realistic budget and learn to live within your actual means." Before she could reply, I hung up the phone. It wasn't gratuitous cruelty. There was simply nothing more to discuss on the subject of the cards. Exactly 45 minutes later, at 8:15 in the morning, my phone rang again. This time Natalie's voice was even more hysterical. "Dad, there's a for sale sign on our building's door, with the phone number of a real estate agency. People are stopping to look and take pictures." "Yes," I confirmed calmly. "Richard Montoya is very efficient. He promised me the sign would be up by Sunday, and he kept his word. But you can't sell our apartment. We live here. Paul goes to school near here. Our whole life is organized around this neighborhood. Natalie, technically it's my apartment. It always has been. I simply allowed you to use it all these years. But after a careful evaluation of the situation, I've decided it's time to put it on the market." "Evaluation of what situation?" she yelled into the phone. "Of the family situation, of the lack of respect, of the chronic ingratitude, of being called miserable by my own daughter in front of the whole family." My voice remained calm, but each word was as precise as a scalpel. There was another long silence. When Natalie spoke again, her voice had changed. The hysterical panic had been replaced by something more calculated, more manipulative. "Dad, I know I made a terrible mistake on Friday. I know I hurt you deeply, and I regret every word. But please, think about Paul. He's innocent in all of this. Do you really want your grandson to suffer for his mother's mistakes? It was a smart move. Paul was indeed my weak spot, the only person in this situation I genuinely cared about without reservation. But it was also exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I had been tolerating for years. Paul is indeed innocent," I agreed. "And precisely for that reason, I think it would be beneficial for him to see that actions have real consequences, that you can't treat people badly and expect them to continue providing unconditional support. But where are we going to live? We don't have money for a security deposit. Without the credit cards, we can't pay for a move. Natalie, you are a 2-year-old woman with a university education. Thomas is a professional architect. I'm sure you will find creative solutions to your financial challenges. Please," her voice broke completely. "Please, Dad, don't do this. I promise I will never disrespect you again. I promise I will change." It was the first time in years I had heard Natalie beg for anything. She had always assumed I would be there to rescue her from any problem, to finance any whim, to solve any crisis. The desperation in her voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt a pang of the old paternal compassion. But then I remembered the satisfied smile on her face as she publicly humiliated me. I remembered years of derogatory comments about my job, my education, my social status. I remembered all the times she had apologized after hurting me, only to repeat the same behavior weeks later. "Natalie," I finally said, "you had 2 previous opportunities to change. On my birthday 2 years ago, and at Cousin Michael's wedding last year. Both times you promised me you would never disrespect me again. Both times I forgave you and moved on as if nothing had happened. But this time is different, Dad. This time I really understand." "No," I interrupted her firmly. "This time the consequences are simply serious enough to scare you. But as soon as things normalize, you'll go back to treating me as you have for years." I sighed deeply before continuing. "Natalie, I have made these decisions after much reflection. They are not the product of the anger of the moment. They are carefully considered decisions about how I want to live the rest of my life." "And what about Paul?" she tried one last time. "What about your grandson? Paul will always be my grandson, and he will always have a place in my life. But that relationship will be independent of my relationship with you. I have already spoken with my lawyer about setting up a trust fund for his education, something that neither you nor Thomas will be able to touch." It was a lie. I hadn't spoken to any lawyer yet, but it sounded convincing and sent the right message. "Dad!" Her voice had been reduced to a whisper. "The sale of the apartment will proceed as planned. You have 60 days to find alternative housing. I suggest you start looking immediately." For the second time that morning, I hung up the phone. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat on my balcony to enjoy the fresh Chicago morning air. For the first time in years, I felt completely in charge of my own life. The phone continued to ring intermittently for the rest of the day, but I didn't answer Natalie's calls again. The new life that had begun on Friday night was taking shape exactly as I had planned. The following days passed in a strangely calm routine. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that I had regained control of my existence, something I hadn't felt in decades. My phone kept receiving calls from Natalie, but I had developed a simple policy. I would only answer 1 call a day, and only if she had something constructive to contribute to the situation. On Tuesday, March 19th, I answered her morning call. Her strategy had evolved from hysterical panic to something more calculated and manipulative. "Dad, I've been talking to Thomas all night. We've done the math, we've reviewed our budget, and the reality is that without your financial help, we can't maintain our current lifestyle." "Interesting observation," I replied as I prepared my breakfast. "And what is your proposal?" "My proposal is that you recognize that this has gone too far. I know I made a terrible mistake, but the punishment can't be worse than the crime. You're destroying your own grandson's life over a comment I made in a moment of weakness." It was fascinating to observe how she had completely reframed the situation. It was no longer about her years of disrespect and ingratitude. Now it was about my disproportionate reaction to a simple comment. "Natalie, let me ask you something," I said, sitting in my favorite chair with my coffee. "During all these years that I've financed your lifestyle, did you ever wonder how your derogatory comments affected me?" "Dad, I never. When you introduced me to your friends at Cousin Michael's wedding as my father, the mechanic with that tone of shame, did you wonder how I felt? That was when, on my birthday 2 years ago, you said that at 62 I was still getting my hands dirty like a teenager. Did you consider the emotional impact of those words? Dad, please, let's not bring up things from the past. They are not things from the past, Natalie. They are a pattern of behavior that culminated on Friday night when you called me miserable in front of the whole family." Her silence lasted several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had a different tone, more defensive than pleading. "Okay, Dad. I admit I've made mistakes. I admit I've been disrespectful at times, but you've also made mistakes as a father. Or have you forgotten all the times you worked late and left me alone when I was a child? It was a low blow, but not unexpected. Guilt was the last resort of manipulators when all other tactics failed." "You're right," I admitted calmly. "I worked long hours when you were little. Do you know why? Because you preferred work to spending time with me. No, Natalie. I worked double shifts to pay for your piano lessons that you quit after 3 months. I worked weekends to finance your ballet classes that you left after 2 weeks. I worked late to pay for your university, to buy your apartment, to maintain the lifestyle you considered your natural right." My voice hardened slightly. "Every extra hour I worked was for you. Every personal sacrifice I made was to ensure you had opportunities I never had, Dad. And now you tell me I preferred work to spending time with you. That's a fascinating interpretation of the facts. Another long silence. I could hear her irregular breathing on the other end of the line. Look, I continued, I don't expect eternal gratitude for having fulfilled my paternal responsibilities, but I do expect basic respect. Respect that I haven't received in years. And what if I promise you that things will change? What if I promise you that I will never disrespect you again? You've already made that promise to me twice before, Natalie. Why should I believe that this time is different? Because now I really understand what I'm losing. No, I corrected her firmly. Now you understand the financial consequences of your actions. That's not the same as understanding the emotional damage you've caused. I heard voices in the background. Thomas was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. Thomas wants to talk to you, Natalie said. You can put him on. There was a noise of the phone changing hands. And then Thomas's voice. Calmer, but just as desperate. Robert, it's Thomas. Look, I understand your frustration with Natalie. You have a right to be angry. But please consider the situation from our perspective. I'm listening. We've been going through financial difficulties for 6 months. My architecture firm has lost 3 major contracts, and the few projects we have are paying months late. We've been depending on your help more than you probably knew. This was the first honest conversation about money I had had with anyone in the family in years. Continue. Without the credit cards and without the apartment, we literally have no resources to support ourselves. Paul will have to change schools. We'll probably have to move out of Chicago, where rents are cheaper. It's devastating. Thomas, I appreciate your honesty, but tell me something. During these 6 months of financial difficulties, did you ever consider voluntarily cutting expenses, moving to a cheaper apartment, changing Paul to a public school, limiting restaurant outings? Well, we were hoping the situation would improve. In the meantime, you continued to spend my money as if it were unlimited. It wasn't our intention to take advantage. Maybe not, consciously, but the result was the same. Thomas sighed audibly. What would we have to do for you to reconsider your decision? It was an important question and deserved a thoughtful answer. Thomas, the fundamental problem is not financial. It's one of respect and recognition. For years I've been treated like an ATM by my own daughter. She has benefited enormously from my support, but has treated me with growing disdain. I understand that, and I agree that it hasn't been fair to you. Then you will understand why I need to see genuine changes, not desperate promises motivated by financial consequences. What kind of changes? It was a good question. What did I really want? Was it possible to repair years of damage with symbolic gestures? Honestly, Thomas, I don't know, but I do know that it can't be something that comes from panic about losing financial support. It has to be something that comes from a genuine recognition of the damage that has been caused. And in the meantime, I recommend that you adapt to your new financial reality. Look for additional jobs. Reduce expenses. Find affordable housing. Learn to live within your actual means. Robert, please. Thomas, let me be very clear with you. This is not a negotiation. It's not a pressure tactic to get apologies or promises. It's a final decision based on years of contemplation. My voice softened slightly. You have always treated me with respect. You have never participated in Natalie's hurtful comments. That's why I'm being so direct with you. You deserve to understand that this is not impulsive or temporary. And Paul will always be my grandson. My relationship with him is independent of my relationship with his mother. I have already made arrangements to ensure that his education is protected. What kind of arrangements? I will discuss that directly with Paul when it is appropriate. But you can be sure that his educational future will not be compromised by this situation. I heard muffled voices again. Thomas was talking to Natalie, probably reporting our conversation. Thomas, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. I want you to know that I feel no personal animosity towards you. This situation is between Natalie and me. But the financial consequences affect you both, because you have built your lifestyle around my support. I understand. I hope you can find a way to navigate this transition in a way that protects Paul as much as possible. I'll do what I can. Good. And Thomas, I suggest you start looking for rental apartments immediately. The real estate market in Chicago moves fast, and you don't want to find yourself without options. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for several minutes. For the first time since Friday night, I felt a small pang of doubt. Not about my decisions, but about whether I was being too hard on Thomas, who was really a collateral victim of this situation. But then I remembered something important. Thomas had been married to Natalie for 7 years. He had witnessed all her derogatory comments towards me. He had never intervened, never defended me, never told her that her behavior was unacceptable. His silence had made him an accomplice. That night, I slept soundly, without nightmares, without remorse. My new life was taking shape exactly as I had planned. Wednesday, March 20th, dawned cloudy, one of those gray Chicago days that seemed to reflect the general emotional state of the city. But I woke up with a mental clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. Every decision I had made since Friday felt more right with each passing day. At 8:30 in the morning, while enjoying my second coffee of the day and reading the sports news, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Christine standing on the landing, with a serious expression I knew well from our years of marriage. I opened the door and invited her in. Christine was 58, but she carried it with elegance. Our divorce had been civilized, motivated more by irreconcilable differences than by betrayal or cruelty. We had managed to maintain a respectful friendship for these 10 years, especially for the sake of Natalie and Paul. "Good morning, Robert," she greeted me, accepting the cup of coffee I offered her. "I suppose you know why I'm here? I imagine Natalie has brought you up to date on the latest events." Christine sat on the couch and studied me with those green eyes that had always been able to read my thoughts with unsettling accuracy. She called me last night, completely hysterical. She cried for an hour on the phone, telling me about the blocked cards, about the sale of the apartment, about how you had changed overnight. "And what is your assessment of the situation?" I asked, sitting across from her. "My assessment is that Natalie finally faced the consequences of years of irresponsible behavior and is in shock because she never thought you would react this way." Her answer surprised me. I had expected her to come to defend Natalie, to mediate a reconciliation, to appeal to my paternal compassion. "You're not here to intercede for her. Robert, I was married to you for 15 years. I know you better than anyone in this world. I know exactly how much pain you've accumulated in silence, how many times you've swallowed hurtful comments, how much you've sacrificed without receiving recognition." She leaned forward, holding her cup with both hands. "I also know that you're incapable of making important decisions on impulse. If you've reached this point, it's because you've considered it carefully for a long time." It was strange to receive this validation from the person who knew me best. Over the last few days, I had begun to doubt if I was being too harsh, if my reaction was proportional to the harm received. "So, you support what I'm doing?" "I support your right to set boundaries and demand respect. I support your decision not to allow yourself to be treated like an emotional ATM." She paused to take a sip of coffee. "But I'm also worried about Paul. Paul is protected." "That's not a real concern." "Protected how?" I explained my plans to set up a trust fund for Paul's education, something I had turned from a white lie into a real plan during my conversations with Natalie. I also told her about my intentions to maintain an independent relationship with my grandson, regardless of what happened between Natalie and me. "That reassures me," Christine admitted. "But Robert, I have to ask you something important. What do you hope to achieve with this? What is your ultimate goal?" It was the most direct question I had received since this situation began. I took several minutes to reflect before answering. For 32 years I have prioritized family peace over my own dignity. I have tolerated disrespect, ingratitude, and humiliation because I believe that's what good fathers do. I convinced myself that unconditional love meant accepting any treatment, no matter how hurtful. I got up and walked to the window overlooking the building's inner courtyard. But on Friday night, when Natalie called me miserable in front of the whole family and laughed at my pain, something broke definitively. It wasn't just that phrase. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, a camel that had been filling up for years. And now I want to live the rest of my life with dignity. I want relationships based on mutual respect, not financial dependence. I want to be valued for who I am, not for what I can provide economically. Christine nodded slowly. "And if Natalie really changes, if she learns from this experience and becomes the daughter you always hoped she would be, that would be the most beautiful evolution possible. But I can't base my decisions on the hope of changes that may never come. I have to make decisions based on the reality of how I've been treated, not on the fantasy of how I could be treated in the future." At that moment, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of David, my brother. "Excuse me, Christine, it's David." "Robert!" My brother's voice sounded tense. "I need to see you urgently. Can you come to my house this afternoon? Has something happened? Thomas came to see me this morning. He's desperate. He wants me to intervene to mediate between you and Natalie." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to talk to you first." "Robert." He told me details about their financial situation that, well, it's worse than we thought. I looked at Christine, who had heard my side of the conversation and had frowned with concern. Can you be more specific? I'd rather not talk about this over the phone. Can you come at 4? I'll be there. I hung up and turned to Christine. Apparently, Thomas has been visiting the family looking for allies. It's understandable. He's scared. Christine, let me ask you something. During all these years, when Natalie made derogatory comments about me, did you ever tell her she was wrong? Did you ever confront her about her behavior? Christine looked down at her coffee cup. Her silence was more eloquent than any answer. I understand, I said softly. You were all accomplices to her behavior, in one way or another. David with his silence, you with yours, Thomas with his passivity. You all allowed it to continue because it was easier than confronting her. Robert, I'm not blaming you, Christine. I'm trying to understand how we got to this point, and the reality is that Natalie never had to face real consequences for her behavior because we all protected her from them. Christine got up and walked to the window. You're right. We all saw her behavior. We all felt uncomfortable with it at different times, but nobody said anything because it was easier to keep the peace. Exactly. And in the meantime, I was the only one who absorbed all the disrespect, all the ingratitude, all the emotional cruelty. She turned to me with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, Robert. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I'm sorry I didn't defend you when I should have. It was the first genuine apology I had received since this situation began. Christine had not been the direct perpetrator of the harm, but she had been a silent spectator, and her acknowledgement of that complicity meant more than I could have imagined. Thank you, I told her simply. That means a lot to me. Is there anything I can do now to help? You can be honest with me about Natalie and Thomas's real situation. How serious is their financial situation? Christine sighed deeply. According to what Natalie told me last night, they've been depending on your help for about 60% of their monthly expenses. Thomas has indeed lost several important contracts, and his firm is on the verge of bankruptcy. And their savings? They have no real savings. Everything they earned, they spent, assuming your financial support would always be available. It was worse than I had imagined. Not only had they built an unsustainable lifestyle, they had built their entire financial stability on the premise of my continued generosity. Christine, I need you to understand something important. This is not a negotiation tactic. I'm not trying to scare them into changing their behavior. These are permanent decisions based on years of reflection. I understand, and I think it's the right thing to do. Her support strengthened me at a time when I had begun to feel pressure from multiple fronts. I knew that the coming weeks would bring more attempts at mediation, more emotional appeals, more manipulation tactics. Will you come with me to David's house this afternoon? I asked her. If you think it might be helpful, I think it could be very helpful. It's time for the whole family to understand that this situation is not negotiable. That afternoon, we went to David's house together, prepared for the most important confrontation of this process. It was time for everyone to understand that the Robert who had tolerated disrespect for decades was gone forever. The man who had taken his place had clear boundaries, real consequences, and the determination to maintain both no matter what family pressure he might face. This new version of myself was about to be tested in ways I hadn't yet fully anticipated. The meeting at David's house that Wednesday afternoon turned out to be more revealing than I had anticipated. My brother lived in a modest but cozy apartment in the Chambery neighborhood, decorated with family photographs documenting decades of Christmas celebrations, birthdays, and important moments that now seemed to belong to a different life. When Christine and I arrived, we found Thomas sitting in a state I could only describe as defeated. He had deep dark circles under his eyes, his clothes were wrinkled as if he had slept in them, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a cup of coffee that was clearly already cold. Robert, he stood up immediately when he saw me enter. Thank you for coming. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you face to face. David offered us seats and prepared fresh coffee. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the weight of conversations that we all knew were inevitable but that no one wanted to have. Thomas has been telling me details about your situation, David began, once we were all seated. Robert, I think there are things you didn't know about how precarious their financial situation had become. I'm listening, I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. Thomas cleared his throat and began what was clearly a speech he had carefully prepared. Robert, my architecture firm, Jimenez and Associates, has been technically bankrupt since December of last year. We lost our most important contract, a residential complex in Las Rosas. Because the real estate developer went bankrupt without paying our fees. He paused to take a sip of his cold coffee. That represented $120,000 that we will never collect. Money we had counted on to pay our own suppliers, our office rent, the salaries of our 3 employees. The information was more serious than I had imagined. When were you planning to tell me all this? Never, Thomas admitted with brutal honesty. We kept hoping that something would turn up, that the situation would resolve itself. In the meantime, we became increasingly dependent on your help without telling you explicitly. Christine intervened. Thomas, how much exactly of your monthly expenses was Robert covering? In January and February of this year, approximately 80%. Between the credit cards for daily expenses, the fact that we weren't paying rent for the apartment, and the occasional loans that Natalie asked for specific expenses. What loans? I asked, feeling a new wave of irritation. Thomas exchanged an uncomfortable look with David. Paul's private English lessons. $300 a month. The new car that Natalie bought in December. She told you it cost $12,000, but it actually cost $18,000. She borrowed the difference, saying it was for apartment repairs. Each revelation was like a slap in the face. Not only had I been financing their lifestyle, I had been systematically deceived about the extent of my financial support. Are there more lies I should know about? The vacation in Ibiza last summer, we told you it cost $2,000, but we spent over $5,000. Natalie asked for additional money several times during the trip, always with different excuses. The silence in the room became suffocating. David was looking at his hands, clearly uncomfortable being the mediator in this revelation of deceit. Christine had an expression of genuine shock. Apparently she hadn't known the full extent of the lies either. Thomas, I finally said, I appreciate your belated honesty, but let me ask you something fundamental. At any point during these months of financial crisis, did you consider looking for an additional job, voluntarily cutting expenses, moving to a cheaper place? We considered all those options, but it was easier to lie to me and use my money. We didn't plan it that way. Things just gradually got more complicated, and your help was there, and it seemed like the simplest solution. The simplest solution for whom? Thomas didn't answer. The answer was obvious. The simplest for them, not necessarily for me. Now, let me tell you what has happened since Monday, I continued. Richard already has 3 interested buyers for the apartment. One of them, a young couple with a baby, is willing to pay the full price in cash without financing, which means the sale can be completed in 30 days instead of 60. I saw the blood drain from Thomas's face. 30 days. Exactly. Which means your time to find alternative housing has been significantly reduced. David finally spoke. Robert, brother, I understand your position and respect your decisions, but is there any way to, maybe, extend the deadline? Give Thomas and Natalie more time to reorganize? Why should I do that, David? Because they're family? Because Paul is innocent? Why? Why is it easier to ask me to be flexible than to demand that they take responsibility for their decisions? The harshness in my voice surprised even myself. But after days of constant pressure, of pleas, of attempts at emotional manipulation, I was losing my patience with the whole family. For years you have all been silent accomplices to Natalie's disrespect towards me. No one said anything when she publicly humiliated me. No one intervened when she made derogatory comments about my job, my education, my social status. You all pretended not to hear, not to see, not to know. I got up and walked to the window overlooking the street. And now, when I finally set boundaries and demand respect, you all come running to ask me for compassion, flexibility, consideration for the family. Robert, Christine began. No, Christine, let me finish. Where was this family concern when I was absorbing years of emotional abuse in silence? Where was this solidarity when I needed someone to defend my dignity? The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Thomas spoke in a broken voice. You're right. We all failed to protect you, to defend you, to set boundaries with Natalie. I saw her behavior many times and said nothing because I didn't want confrontation at home. It was the first genuine admission of guilt I had heard from anyone other than Christine. And now, Thomas, now that the consequences affect you directly, now you want to intervene? Now I understand that our silence was cruelty towards you, but I'm also desperate, Robert. I have an 8-year-old son who is going to have to change schools, who is going to have to move far away from his friends, whose world is falling apart because of mistakes he didn't make. His voice broke completely. And I know that none of that is your responsibility. I know that the decisions we made led us here. but I also know that you have the power to make this transition less traumatic for an innocent child. It was the most effective argument I had heard so far. It didn't appeal to my compassion for Natalie or Thomas, but to my love for Paul. What exactly are you suggesting? That you allow us to stay in the apartment until the end of Paul's school year? It's only 3 more months. It would give us time to find something in the same school district to make the transition gradually. And in return, Natalie will come here, in front of the whole family, and apologize genuinely, not because she's financially desperate, but because she finally understands the damage she has caused you over the years. I looked at David and Christine. Both seemed surprised by the proposal, but also hopeful. And you think Natalie is willing to do that? Honestly, I don't know, but I think it's her only chance to safeguard her son's well-being. And after that apology, what guarantee do I have that we won't go back to the same pattern of behavior once the crisis is over? You have no guarantee, Thomas admitted, but at least you will have given a final opportunity for her to show that she can change. It was a reasonable proposal, but also a dangerous one. I knew my natural tendency would be to give in to any sign of genuine remorse from Natalie, but I also knew I had given in too many times in the past. I need to think about it, I finally said, but I want to be clear about something. If I accept this proposal, it will be the last chance. There will be no fourth chance, no matter the circumstances. Understood, Thomas nodded quickly. And the credit cards remain permanently canceled. You have to find a way to survive financially without my direct support. Also understood. And Natalie's apology can't be a desperate performance motivated by panic. She has to show genuine understanding of the damage she has caused over the years, not just the incident on Friday. I'll make her understand. Mireya, Christine, and David, are you willing to be witnesses to this potential reconciliation? Both nodded. Then organize a family meeting for Sunday afternoon, here at David's house. If Natalie can show genuine remorse and real understanding of her mistakes, I will consider extending the sale deadline until June. Thomas stood up immediately and shook my hand with evident gratitude. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for giving this opportunity. Don't thank me yet, Thomas. This may be the most difficult conversation of Natalie's life, and if it doesn't go well, there will be no more opportunities. As Christine and I were heading home that night, she commented, I think you've given her a fair chance, fairer than she deserves, honestly. Do you think she'll be capable of a genuine apology? Frankly, I don't know. The Natalie I know is too proud to admit deep-seated mistakes, but maybe desperation will make her more humble. That night I went to bed with a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. Part of me desperately wanted Natalie to be able to show genuine growth, for this crisis to transform her into the daughter I had always hoped to have. But another part of me, the part that had been repeatedly hurt, prepared for the final disappointment. Sunday afternoon would reveal which of those two parts was right. Sunday, March 24th, arrived with a light rain that seemed to wash the streets of Chicago and symbolically set the stage for what would be the most important conversation of my family life. In the preceding days, I had oscillated between the hope of a genuine reconciliation and the preparation for a final disappointment. I arrived at David's house at 5 in the afternoon, as we had agreed. The apartment was arranged formally, chairs organized in a circle, coffee prepared, an atmosphere that suggested the seriousness of the moment. Christine was already there, visibly nervous. David obsessively checked the arrangement of the seats, channeling his anxiety through frantic activity. Thomas arrived punctually, followed 5 minutes later by Natalie. When I saw her enter, I was surprised by her appearance. She was pale, had lost weight, visibly, and had deep dark circles under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Her clothes, usually impeccable, were wrinkled. For the first time in years, she seemed vulnerable, stripped of that armor of superiority she had worn for so long. "Hi, Dad," she greeted me in a barely audible voice, avoiding direct eye contact. Natalie. We sat in the circle that David had prepared. The initial silence was uncomfortable, laden with expectations and fears. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Robert, Natalie has something to say to you, something she has been preparing for days." I looked at my daughter, waiting. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched for the right words. "Dad," she began in a shaky voice, "for the past few days I've had to face a reality that I had been avoiding for years. The reality of who I've become and how I've treated you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she continued. "When I was a child, you were my hero. You worked tirelessly to give me everything I needed, and much of what I simply wanted. I vividly remember how you sold your motorcycle to pay for my university, although you never told me where that money came from until now. The surprise must have been evident on my face. I didn't expect her to have discovered that detail. Thomas told me, she explained, reading my expression. He told me many things that you never said, many sacrifices you made in silence. And I realized that at some point during my transition to adulthood, I stopped seeing you as my father and started seeing you as a financial resource. The tears began to fall freely down her cheeks. It's horrible to admit that, but it's the truth. Instead of thanking you for everything you did, I started to consider it my right. Instead of respecting you for your honest work, I was ashamed of it. Instead of valuing your humility, I interpreted it as a lack of ambition. She paused to dry her eyes with the tissue that Christine offered her. On Friday night, when I said those terrible words, I didn't say them just because of the alcohol. I said them because they reflected what I had really come to think of you, and that makes me the most ungrateful and cruel person in the world. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of the traffic outside seemed to have disappeared. Natalie took a deep breath before continuing. During these days, without your credit cards, without the security of the apartment, I've been forced to face who I really am when I don't have your safety net. And the answer is terrifying. I'm a 32-year-old woman who never learned to value what she has until she loses it. She got up from her chair and knelt in front of me, a gesture that took me completely by surprise. Dad, I'm not just asking for forgiveness for the words on Friday. I'm asking for forgiveness for years of disrespect, for years of taking your unconditional love for granted, for years of being ashamed of the most honorable man I know. Her sobs intensified. I'm asking for forgiveness for not defending you when others disrespected you, for not publicly acknowledging everything you sacrificed for me, for turning your generosity into an expectation instead of a gift. My own heart was breaking. For so many years, I had dreamed of hearing exactly these words, of seeing exactly this recognition, but now that it was happening, I was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Get up, Natalie, I told her gently. She stood up but kept her eyes fixed on the floor. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've exhausted all my chances. But I also know that if I don't try this, I will regret for the rest of my life not having fought for the most important relationship of my existence. Look at me, I asked. When she finally looked up, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Genuine humility. Not the performative humility of someone trying to manipulate, but the real humility of someone who has hit rock bottom and has recognized their fundamental mistakes. Natalie, I appreciate your words, more than you could imagine. But I need to ask you something crucial. If I accept this apology, if I extend the deadline for the sale of the apartment, what guarantee do I have that this revelation is permanent and not temporary? You have no guarantee, she replied immediately. You only have my word that these days have changed something fundamental in me. You only have my promise that I will work every day to be worthy of the father I always had, but never valued properly. And how do you propose to demonstrate that? By finding a job immediately, no matter how humble. By contributing financially to our family instead of just being a burden. By treating you with the public respect you always deserved. And most importantly, by teaching Paul to value and respect his grandfather as the extraordinary man he is. Her words had the weight of sincerity. There was no exaggerated drama, no grandiose promises impossible to keep. Only the clear recognition of specific mistakes and concrete commitments for change. I looked at Christine, who had tears in her eyes. I looked at David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I looked at Thomas, whose expression mixed hope and terror. Natalie, I finally said, I'm going to make a decision that may be the most difficult of my life. I'm going to give you one final chance. Not because you owe me anything, but because I believe in the possibility that people can fundamentally change when they face the real consequences of their actions. I saw the relief flood her face, but I raised a hand to stop any premature celebration. But this opportunity comes with non-negotiable conditions. First, the apartment is sold in June definitively. This gives you 3 months to find alternative stability. Second, my credit cards remain canceled forever. You have to learn to live within your actual means. Third, any future disrespect, any regression to previous behavior, will result in the definitive severing of our relationship. I understand and accept all those conditions, she replied without hesitation. And finally, I continued, I want you to understand that my relationship with you from now on will be conditional. Not conditional on your financial dependence, but conditional on your respect and recognition. The unconditional love I gave you for 32 years did not survive Friday night. What we build now will have to be earned day by day. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was not charged with tension, but with understanding and acceptance. 8 months later, in December 2024, I can say that Natalie kept every one of her promises. She found a job as an administrative coordinator at a logistics company, a position that pays her modestly, but which she performs with genuine dedication. Thomas managed to partner with another architect, and they are slowly rebuilding their professional practice. They moved in June to a smaller apartment in Joliet, half an hour by train from the city center. Paul adapted better than expected, and even seems to enjoy having a community garden where he can play. My relationship with Natalie has transformed completely. It is no longer the dependent father-child relationship that had persisted for decades. It is the relationship between two adults who respect each other, where love is expressed through thoughtful gestures and careful words. I see Paul 2 Saturdays a month, taking him to museums, parks, and activities that expand his world. Natalie never interferes in these moments, respecting the independence of our relationship. The trust fund for Paul's education was officially established in September, ensuring that his future opportunities are protected, regardless of family circumstances. Have I completely forgiven? That is a complex question. I have accepted the apologies and have allowed the rebuilding of our relationship, but the scars of years of disrespect do not disappear overnight. What I can say is that for the first time in decades, I feel respected and valued by my own daughter. The most important lesson I have learned is that true love sometimes requires painful boundaries. That being a good father does not mean accepting any treatment, that personal dignity is not negotiable, not even for family, and that it is never too late to demand the respect one deserves, no matter how much pain it causes to establish those limits. Life goes on, but now it does so on my terms. If you like this story, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.